So it's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker. Dr. Ferguson Irlanda is I would call an interdisciplinary marine social scientist. Formally, she is a research associate in the Environmental Social Sciences Department at Stanford. She's one of these people that works on the ground with local communities to understand how economic, racial, gender, and environmental justice issues intersect in the seafood sector. So she partners with fishers and their families to advance food sovereignty, support equitable decision making, address environmental degradation, and resist colonization. She particularly works closely with young people in Palau, where U.S. militarization has affected the people and their seafood. Dr. Ferguson today is going to be speaking on, I believe, an alternate model for fisheries research that she and her colleagues are developing in Palau. So with that brief introduction, over to you.
Thank you so much for the introduction. It's wonderful to be here. I was sharing with Professor Rosen just before we started that I have never been part of an oceans or fisheries department. I'm usually the only oceans person in the room. So it's nice to not have to do the whole why fisheries are important, why should we care about the ocean part of the presentation. We're all starting from that shared point. I am presenting today on work that has all been done in partnership with Anne Singeo, who unfortunately, because of time zone, can't present with me today, but she is excited about the presentation and is open to you messaging her in her inbox about the presentation. So let me know if you would like her contact info. I can put it in the chat. Today I wanted to share, I thought about like, should I just share a recent paper or a project that's already wrapped up? That would be nice and easy, but really the thing that's been motivating me the most over the last many years, particularly the last year, has been not just the products of research, but the process of research, the way that we do research and how the process also shapes the product. So I titled the talk Decolonial Partnerships in Fisheries Science. I think I'm sharing maybe a case study of that, of my partnership with Anne at Beale Society in Palau. And decolonial being the first word, this is increasingly the case. And I've been increasingly convinced over our 7 years of partnership that decolonization really has to be at the center of our work together for more reasons than practical reasons. And so I just want to share some of what we've done together over the course of our partnership. Also, how my thinking has changed, how our thinking has changed about, the process of fisheries science. So I hope that you'll go with me on this, sort of ideas that are always evolving. I'm constantly learning and unlearning, and so I really look forward to the Q&A. Invite you to bring your own experience um, and knowledge to the discussion. So I'm gonna go chronologically. So I started my dissertation in 2017 and started collecting my data in 2018. And up through today, I'm still working with Abeille Society. Abeille Society is a community-based nonprofit that Anne Singeo, my partner, founded and is the executive director of. They're based in Narlang, Palau. For folks that don't know, Palau is a Pacific Island nation. It gained its independence from the United States in the 90s, and it still maintains a very close relationship with the United States, which I'll get a little bit to toward the end of the presentation. But it's really an indigenous nation. The majority of people in Palau are indigenous. Everyone in government is indigenous. It's a population of somewhere between 10 and 20,000, depending on whose numbers you believe. Um, and the fish management system is layered at this point. But again, that's something I'll get into as we talk a little bit more about the projects that we're working on. Abeille Society just celebrated its 20th year, so they were around long before I came along, and their mission has always been to facilitate the transmission of ecological knowledge across generations. So their work is cultural and environmental. But in 2018, I was collecting data for my PhD. And I really was trained or was being trained to use this very specific set of rigorous social science tools that had been developed and vetted by academics in the West which emphasized reproducibility, right? Randomization is a huge part of the way that we approach research, triangulation, the idea that we're using multiple methods in order to get to some kind of truth that we can then, share across many different contexts. And I approached Anne first as an interviewee because she is a knowledge holder and a fisherwoman. I was interviewing people in many different states about the sea cucumber fishery there. I found it very interesting because women primarily collect sea cucumbers, and also it's this big international commodity. And that, for me, was where my interests lay. Anne was very generous in connecting me with folks to interview. She helped me identify translators and quote research assistants in order to execute this research that I had developed back at Stanford. Um, I'm going to share some of the findings from that research now, which I published as a sole author in a scientific journal. And looking back with the benefit of everything that I know now in 2025, I do think that the findings are accurate. They hold up. I learned a lot about Palau. I learned a lot about sea cucumber fisheries. I learned a lot about research. Like, I checked a lot of the boxes of my PhD program. Um, I have heard that the publication has been useful to people in other contexts, but I'm very confident that it provided zero new information to the community that gave me all of their time in order to do the study. And how could it have, right? Like I asked them questions and they answered them. So I really just published a paper on what they already knew. I also know that the way that I spoke and wrote about gender in this study is a lot more likely to lead to conflict than it is to equity. And that is if anyone can pull out over to read the paper because it's behind a paywall. It's not very accessible. I know now that this research was more extractive and less of a partnership, certainly less of a partnership in the work that we're doing now. But nonetheless, I want to share the findings because they did serve as a foundation for my own understanding of this fishery and this context, and as the foundation for my partnership with the Beale Society. Already these findings were beginning to expand my own understanding of how fisheries fit within this cultural context, which I think is helpful for sharing with all of you who are likely not familiar with the context of Palau. Um, and I think that they also just begin to tease the centrality of colonization to understanding the problem of vegetation and environmental decline, not only in Palau, but across many different contexts. So. There we go. So many of the women and men that I interviewed for this study told me how important collecting sea cucumbers was, not just as a source of food, it's really not that important to the caloric intake of anyone in Palau, but as this place where women bring children to learn about the environment and the values of really the environment. And so this first quote is from a young man. He said, "While gleaning, our family teaches us about the animals, the uses for different plants, and also conservation values. Like at that one, it's the time for spawning. They teach us social responsibilities too. For example, if I catch a certain fish, I will share it with my aunties and my sisters." And an older woman shared with me, "My mother was always telling us, if you're not going to eat that, then don't take it. We collect oruer, and my mother knows how much we're going to get. Don't get all the ones we find. We always only took the biggest. Even until now that I am an adult, when I go collect oruer, those are the ones that I collect." And so important for the sea cucumber fishery is not just that, it has inherent value as a species or that it's instrumentally important for income or food, but that is really part of this very important process of cultural transmission. Now, these photos were taken in 2011 by Kalo Pakoa, and these are photos of the very brief window in time when the export of sea cucumbers was being done to Chinese markets. As I mentioned, sea cucumber is this massively valuable international commodity, if you're not aware. And in Palau, just as this happened, basically everywhere that exporting sea cucumbers has ever happened, it was this massive event. I mean, people quit their jobs to go collect sea cucumbers because there was so much money to be made so quickly. It was really a gold rush. And so what you see in these photos, first of all, just the volume of sea cucumber is tremendous. That is way more sea cucumber than any family could ever eat. You'll also see the motorboats, the photos on the left. Women are typically just going out on foot or on a kayak. And a motorboat just allows you to not only fill the boat with tons of sea cucumber, but to access sea cucumbers much further from shore, right? Often the larger sea cucumbers. And the last thing you might notice if you look closely is that none of these photos are men. So really even though it was the same sea cucumbers that were being targeted for the Chinese market, it was a characteristically different fishery that was happening. And in fact, one woman said they totally wiped them out in fast. In fact, many women said something to this effect. And the Palau International Coral Reef Center did a study in 2012 of one of these sites where sea cucumbers were being harvested for the Chinese market, and you see just this massive, massive decline after the 2011 harvest. We've seen since very little recovery, and that's the nature of sea cucumber fisheries. They're broadcast spawners, and so if they don't have significant enough densities to find each other in the water column, reproduction is not going to be successful. And again, I love a fisheries audience. I don't have to over-explain that. One woman said it was the men, not the women. I remember sitting there asking the men in the community, "Excuse me, it belongs to the women. Why are you encroaching?" It's about money. It's not about the people or the culture. It's really just about money. And women lament the perceived loss of this fishery. Gleaning is such an important part of women's lives in this community, and now it's gone. It feels like a part of our life was taken away from you. And another woman said, gleaning is a part of who we are, and I don't want to lose that. We are losing our identity. And so it was really clear from doing this research that not only was sea cucumber more important than just a snack, right? But it was really central in activity to cultural transmission, to the intergenerational transfer of knowledge, to all the things that a Beale Society is really very concerned with, to the of environmental sustainability even. And many women said that farming sea cucumbers was an avenue that they wanted to try. And so naively in 2019, a Beale Society and I formally partnered together to try to farm sea cucumbers in this very small community setting. Some of you may know where this is going. If any of you have been involved in an aquaculture project, it's so much harder than we thought it was going to be. But we learned a lot in the process, and I think we had some success. So I'm going to share just a little bit about that project. We got really lucky in that there was a guy, Alex Ferrier-Lowe, who had just done his master's degree at cucumbers, who had like just joined his girlfriend on the island and didn't have a job and was really excited to help us out. And so in this photo on the right and bottom, this is Sure Bells, who is a Palauan woman who worked with me on this project, who worked with us on this project, and Alex Ferrier-Lowe on the right. And I love this photo because they are teaching each other what they know about sea cucumbers. And neither was supposing that they had knowledge supremacy, but just different kinds of knowledge that could be valuable for this project. And in fact, both of them did. Our initial setup for this farm, which if you see on the top right, this is literally like a bin. Very, very small operation. We had concrete tanks at a Beale Society that had already been constructed that we were trying to use to hold the sea cucumbers. But the setup was based on the scientific literature that had been published about farming sea cucumbers that Alex was familiar with from his master's. The problem was all of the published literature was on industrial scale production, and we were really just trying to grow enough to help restore these areas. And the hope was that, you know, the community could work together to farm these sea cucumbers at a small scale. So when we established the project, local fisherwomen were advising on all sorts of things. They first advised on which species we should cultivate, which is Holothurius scea or Irlanda in Palauan. There was local knowledge of this species. It's an important food species. There was interest. They can sell it at local markets. There was sufficient scientific literature. This is one of the species that's targeted for the Chinese market, and so there's a lot of interest in farming this species. And because of the Chinese trade, it was a highly depleted fishery that they determined was in need of restoration. They informed us where to find sea cucumbers, what their habitat were at various life stages, changes in their density and size over time that they had observed over their lifetimes, their reproductive behaviors and the timing of the production. We use this to inform when we would collect the sea cucumbers for spawning. So they let us know that they typically spawn 3 days before the full moon. And so we ordered them one day before that and spawned them in a tank when they were really nice and full of gametes. And then just on the general social and cultural acceptability of farm sea cucumbers, which again, really broadly acceptable. And there was a lot of enthusiasm for it. I would say this project was, as I said, a mixed success, a success, but not an unmitigated one. We were able to produce tens of thousands of sea cucumbers by partnering with the government and getting use of their larger facility and their technical expertise. It was also a success because every time that we planted sea cucumbers in the environment, which was quarterly, we did it like a community day. So we got the sea cucumber fisherwomen as well as a lot of youth to come and transplant the sea cucumbers. People were also collecting sea cucumbers to eat, which was surprising to me at first, I think, but was so much fun because these young people who really hadn't been eating a lot of sea cucumbers because they had been so depleted for much of their lives, they got to try them in different ways for the first time and mix them with Kool-Aid powder and find new ways of eating them that they enjoyed. We also set up a monitoring program. And so a lot of people got trained in how to do this kind of formal monitoring, which is maybe the next phase of this research to share a little bit about. We set up a participatory restoration and monitoring program. So the first step of that was to map out places where sea cucumbers had been before and were no longer found, and also where the juveniles were found. And we did this in 3 different states. This is just a photo of one of the mapping days. We got people from different generations with different knowledge of the different villages, so the different areas in the water where they were collecting different species. And this was also kind of a jumping off point, right, to get the community involved in the project. We did monitoring with those women and their families and anyone else who wanted to come and have a fun day out on the water. We provided lunch and boats. And as I said, it was really a community fun day. But this was another place where we bridged kind of the Western science with the Palauan science or the Palauan knowledge. We used the fisherwomen's choices of where they wanted to monitor, where the important sites were for them, but like random transects using quadrats, following a scientific protocol that had already been used by scientists in the past in Palau, so that we could compare to past data. Or so we thought. One really interesting thing that we came across, this is just anecdotally, but we're collecting the data on it now, is when outside scientists, international scientists such as myself, or we had a group of undergraduates from OSU come and do monitoring with the community. We find way fewer sea cucumbers than when Palauans are doing this. And there's actually even a difference between girls and boys when we have girls and boys monitor separately on separate teams because the Palauan girls and women are really taught to look for sea cucumbers. Right? They're looking for them for food and to sell them. And this is something they know how to do. They're just sitting there in your transect. If you look down and count, you kind of have to dig for them in the seagrasses. And so this is another, I think, example of why having local people not only collecting the data, but interpreting the data is really important because I may have seen that the girls and boys had different numbers and just assumed it was because of the different sites, right? I mean, hopefully we would eventually have figured out that was systematic, but it was immediately evident to Anne and to the folks at Abeal Society. And so, again, just I think it's an anecdote that we're going to dig further into and speaking to the importance of working with local people. Okay, in 2021, I was finishing up my PhD and I really didn't know how long I had to commit to continuing to come to Palau. I saw that there were a lot of international researchers who came, extracted their data, and left. I knew I didn't want to be one of those. There's just very little social science in general going on in Palau. And as everyone in this room knows, fisheries are fundamentally like they're about fish and they're about people. Like you can't remove one or the other from the equation, or in this case, sea cucumbers. um, and so we really wanted to build the I don't like the phrase local capacity so much. I feel like it's kind of misused or overused, but we wanted to build the base of knowledge locally to do, rigorous social science that would be respected by institutions, by scientific journals, and also acceptable and appropriate according to Palauan protocols and Palauan epistemologies. And so Anne and I created a decolonizing environmental social science research class, which is a clunky name that we should probably change, but we haven't yet. Every year now, in the fourth year of the class, we recruit a small number of high school students for a year-long weekend class. So they come not every weekend, but weekends of the school year. First, we teach them how to conduct interviews. And again, we teach them the rigorous social science method. We talk about sampling and we talk about writing good interview questions, right? Not writing leading questions, for example. And then Anne also teaches them the own protocols. So how do you introduce yourself? They always introduce themselves with their own name and with their parents' names. They always bring a humble gift with them. And that reiterates that we're the ones in the position of poverty, seeking knowledge, which is so radically different than the way I was taught. Oh, I'm the one with power. I have to somehow um, give power back, um, or give money in many cases, right? We are taught to pay interviewees, and I think it's complicated. It's not so straightforward that one person has power and the other doesn't. But in the Palauan way that the students approach these interviews, um, we teach them you're the one seeking knowledge, you're the ones in a position of poverty. And so they bring a very humble gift. Usually it's cinnamon rolls. Um, we teach them to do interviews and then we travel around the country and they develop their own research question as a class and each student develops their own interview questions within that research question. And so last year we were studying farming and the students, you can see in this middle Facebook post, launched their book. They were so proud of their book, and I'm going to share a few pages of it because I was also very proud of them. I think it's extraordinary. The year before, they studied dugongs, the history and behavior and the role of dugongs in the ecosystem. And this year, they're studying traditional fisheries practices and governance. And so this audience would be really interested, I think, to learn their findings. But again, there's just a few pages from their book. I just think it's so beautiful, and I'm so proud of what they've written. I think it also shows why decolonization has to be central to this work. This again is a book about farming, although the book about fishing is going to be similar. You can't get very far asking people about their farming practices before they talk about, oh, well, it used to be this way, but now I have to go to work, and so actually I have hired help. Or oh, it used to be this way, but now that land was developed, and so we eat rice. We also heard this idea really frequently, young Palauans don't want to farm. And we've again heard that this year, young Palauans fish. And each of the students wrote a reflection on that idea that they kept coming across, that they don't want to farm. And maybe not surprising to this audience, but surprising to a lot of the older people that they interviewed, they express that they do want to farm, but they don't know how. They were never brought to the farm or they're in school and so they don't have, the time to go learn or they don't know where their land is. And so Beal Society is really starting to fill this gap. As part of this class, we took them to the farm and they learned some of the basic methods from the elders in the community, many times from their own relatives. And so the hope is that the research class is not just teaching them to research, but is connecting them with their relations, connecting them with the land and the water, and with their culture in a way that can sustain them no matter what they do with their lives. I don't expect most of them will become social scientists. And some of the students' reflections, I think, are again really telling about what is important about environmental work or about fisheries science, that it's not just the environment. So Eddie Clow wrote, the research class has instilled in me a profound love for my culture, my environment, my island, and most importantly, my identity as a Palauan. This class enabled us to dive deep into our history about colonization and agroforestry through storytelling by our elders. Childhood stories ranging from surviving World War II to simple events like being in the Maasai with their families really opened my eyes on how my island has greatly changed over the years. The things you learn, the people you meet, and the connections you make are like no other. This class taught me to speak up for what I believe is right for my home, my life, my people. And then Kimie, who is like such a teenager, she wrote, I go to school where I am not allowed to speak my own language. Throughout my middle school years, I got threatened to get sent to the principal's office by teachers just because I was speaking Palauan. I believe that coming onto a person's land and telling them they can't practice their own culture or speak their own language is a violation of human rights at all levels. As a result of 11 years in the school system, I've slowly begun to lose my language and I find myself stuttering and looking for words to speak in Palauan. But it's fine because I can write and say a whole speech in English, right? Sarcastic tone. I honestly could write a whole book about that, and I guess we did. I love Kimi's reflection again because of her attitude, and I just think she has a wonderful spirit. But also because it has nothing to do with farming or fishing, which are the subjects of the class. This is what she learned through the process of speaking with people about farming. She learned that it is about language and it's about culture and it is about the institutions that restrict her ability to practice her culture. Um, and I love that reflection. So last year, the students also researched militarization. The US, as I briefly mentioned, maintains a very close relationship with Palau. It's called free association. And over the last 3+ years, there's been very rapid development of military, not bases, but fields, radar facilities, and the like, um, which has gone unchallenged until very recently. So the students interviewed people about the impact of this military activity in their communities, and particularly the impact on their foods. I'm just going to share one quote for the sake of time that's more closely related to fisheries. People shared all sorts of different impacts on their health and their culture. But this person was really angry about the destruction of crab habitat. So he says, this is the first time in my life coming to Angar and not crab hunting. I grew up here and I always go crab hunting. And that area that they cleared, I know to not just affect crabs, but also specifically coconut crabs and all animals in Angar which are being displaced. These animals are just like us humans. If you destroy their home, they won't know where to go. The only time to see how big of an area they cleared is when I come on the plane. And when I see the area they cleared, I think of the animals that live there from the biggest animal all the way to the smallest because it was their home. And this is the view coming into Angar from the plane. This is now over a year old. They've developed further and cleared more land, but it is a shocking, it's almost a third of the island. And as this person said, it's the entirety of the coconut crab habitat in Indian species. People are also really worried about contamination, as I think they should be. What we see in Guam and Puerto Rico and other places where the US has developed military sites, seafood becomes contaminated almost without exception. And so we started a project to monitor the water for PFAS, which is just one contaminant of concern. There are many, many more that we're hoping to be able to monitor into the future. But the students, as a result of this research, really wanted to do something. They were angry and frustrated that the most common response they got was, I have no idea what's going on. And so luckily, we're very close with Blue Ocean Law, which is a law firm based in Guam that works specifically on decolonization issues in Oceania. And they filed a complaint with the UN Special Rapporteur on human rights, both the right to a clean, safe, and healthy environment and Indigenous rights. And this has caused a lot of stir on the island. The president is very pro-military and has attacked the students. Well, attacked might be too strong of a word, but questioned whether they were motivated by Chinese influence. Um, the students were very intentional, and Anne was very intentional about blaming the US military for not following environmental laws, for not informing the public in the way that that they should for not providing the opportunity for free, prior, and informed consent. There are lawsuits going on the island. Many people are pointing the finger at each other. But going back to not wanting to create conflict in the community, how do we, with our work, rather than create conflict within the community, actually provide the opportunity for unity, for coming together? And so the hope with this has been that Palauans can come together and point the finger where it belongs. Okay, and then finally, this is the work that we're developing now and that we'll be spending a lot of the next year working on, is something that Anne has been dreaming of for a very long time, that has become a dream of mine as well, is to support the decentralization of fisheries management. Palau, like so many Pacific Island nations, historically had a highly localized fisheries management system that was governed by chiefs and enforced by the community based on rights. So if I'm from Village A, I have the right to fish in the waters of Village A, etc. This was centralized by colonial powers, and upon independence, this centralization was maintained. Most islands now have a Ministry of Fisheries or Department of Fisheries. Palau is no exception. But what happened in Palau when the centralized fisheries management system was created is, because Palau is this place of extraordinary knowledge about fisheries management and a real ethic of conservation, they created the Protected Areas Network. And every state in Palau has a permanent no-take protected area, which is not a Palauan way of managing things. They would have temporary protected areas, areas, again, where only certain people are allowed as a strategy of management. And now that the community of Niwal, which you see is in the middle on the East Coast here, wants to return and revive this traditional management system, this rights-based management system, recognizing that the centralized system has not been good for the sustainability of fisheries in Palau. They're running up directly against this protected area network because the protected area in Niwal is completely overlapping with one village's rights-based area. So it means if they were to revive the traditional system, people in this village would have no rightful place to fish at all, or they would be illegally fishing in the protected area. And so already, before we even get started with what this might look like, what legal framework might be appropriate, restoring this effective traditional fisheries management system is going to require this decolonization of the fisheries management system, this removal of the protected area, or some other way of navigating that conflict. So this is just something on the horizon, and again, not unique to Palau. I want to use just a few minutes and then I'll wrap up to talk about a paper that Anne and I published together 2 years ago. We titled it Lessons from Palau to End Parachute Science and International Conservation Research. And we share 5 Palauan proverbs, which are guiding principles for us in our work and which we think can be helpful in other international research partnerships, whether they're decolonial or they're simply looking to do things in a more ethical way. Thinking about authorship, again, I hope we can have some of that discussion. I wrote this paper, but Anne is the first author on this paper because these are really her ideas. This is what she has taught me. I, as an academic, like, I'm taught to write papers. I know how to find citations, right? But that doesn't mean that I should be first author necessarily. Like, these aren't really my ideas. These are her ideas that I turned into a scientific paper. So she's the first author and I'm the second author. Okay, so the first principle is to come with an empty basket. A researcher arriving with an empty basket and seeking to fill that basket listens before acting. They recognize that environmental values aren't universal, that conservation can take many different forms, or fisheries management for that matter can take many different forms, and that local needs and values need to be prioritized to avoid reproducing harms. So often our basket is already full, as mine was when I arrived in Palau, with research questions and with methods and with an idea of how they would be applied and where I want to publish the findings. But I've learned from Anne that the best practice is to wait, to hear what's needed, and later, if it's appropriate as a scientist, bring those skills that we have to bear on the project. This one's very elegant in Palauan and just totally inelegant in English, but Tukoy Alwalul, it basically means that like the waves of the ocean, all knowledge is coming in different sizes and different shapes, but no wave is overcoming another one, and they're all going to reach the beach. This means that no knowledge is superior to others. It calls on us to recognize local knowledge, but also importantly, to recognize a diversity of local knowledge. A lot of times when fishers' knowledge is included in research, it is only the elites or only the men, or only the person that works at the NGO. But everyone is going to have a different knowledge of the ocean based on their relationship with it, what species they target, how long they've been fishing, right? Why they fish. All of those are going to shape how we see the fishery. Acknowledge from whom you're borrowing knowledge. This has to do with authorship in part, right? Authorship is really our currency in academia. But a failure to recognize the many contributions of local partners has led to their exclusion from much of the published literature. As I mentioned, the first paper I published from my PhD, I was the sole author. There is no way I could have done that paper by myself. I would never do it that way again. If I could undo it, I would. Um, in fact, I wonder if you can publish a correction for authorship, but that's another conversation. We need to acknowledge diverse contributions, not just who's doing the writing, but whose ideas are in the paper, who collected the data, who analyzed the data, who made the science useful for the community, who got you permission to work in that community. Hopefully you got permission to work in that community, right? All of these are contributions to science. Authorship is only one way to value them. Not everybody wants to be an author on a scientific publication. Some people just don't value that. And has found it to be very valuable in legitimizing our work and in finding funding. There are also times, though, when she has said, please leave me off that paper. It's very political, and I don't want my name to be associated with it. I want it published, but I don't want my name on it. And so acknowledgement doesn't just mean authorship, but it's one important way that we as scientists can spread the wealth. Practice reciprocity. This is just so central. I think about this every day now. My son is 6 months old today. And every day I think about how do I teach him that we need to be in reciprocal relation with those around us, with people in our community, with non-human beings in our community. But specifically in the context of decolonial partnerships, we benefit as international scientists. Well, I won't assume everyone in the room kind of fits that title, but I'll say for myself, I benefit through knowledge production, through publication, through all of the accolades and promotions and opportunities that come with publication, and presentations to wonderful audiences. But reciprocity is about ensuring that the local people engaged in the research are receiving at least as much benefit, if not greater benefit. This includes the development of scientific capacity locally. So, for example, with the class that we have, but there are many other ways of developing capacity to make sure that folks aren't always dependent on outside expertise to come in and execute research that they want to have happen. Many, many other ways that we can practice reciprocity. And finally, become words of the land. This means make something useful to people. Make something that will be used and remembered and retained. And so academic publications are often behind paywalls, or even if they're open access, like what does it really mean and what language are they written? Even if they're written in a language people read, what's the register, right? Like how much jargon are we using? It's not always accessible, a scientific publication, even though we may try. And so what other ways are we ensuring that people can use the research findings? We say just work with your local partner to understand what's locally and culturally appropriate. It's going to differ by context and by audience, even within that context. But it's important that our research can empower local people to develop their own policies rather than relying on us to tell them, here's what we found and here's what we recommend. Okay, so a few conclusions, and these are a little clunky. I hope that our discussion can be broad-ranging. But colonization is really central to the global challenge of fisheries decline. It's not just in Palau, but I hope I've illustrated a little bit of how it's happened in Palau. And so decolonization is central to sustaining fisheries. Decolonial research is not only a morally imperative, um, not only a moral imperative, but it's also a practical necessity for high quality and meaningful results and for ongoing relationships. If we intend to go back, let's not burn bridges. It's also really hard to work in a place when other researchers have burned bridges. Um, Universities, funding agencies, and journals are all reinforcing the colonial model of research. We do this by explicitly and implicitly valuing only Western methodologies, by narrowly recognizing citations as a metric of scientific contribution, by ignoring the many, many things that we can do to advance decolonial practice that are not publication, right? Community engagement, inclusion, mentoring, collaboration. I won't even say DEI in the modern context, although you're in Canada, so lucky you. Scientific institutions and peers, we also have to demand and reward the ethical practice of research, not just the findings themselves, not just the publications, but how was the work done? We need to ask the questions. There are so many people and entities to acknowledge, but most importantly, again, Auntie Nsingeo, who without none of this would be possible. This is her with my son in the bottom right. We just got back from Palau a couple weeks ago. She is his Lola and so special to us. And I also put the student researchers' names on the slide as well as my advisors at Stanford. So with that, I think we're at 44 minutes. I'm going to stop. And I'm really excited to have a bit of discussion with you.
Okay, thank you very much, Carolyn. That was wonderful. We're going to open it up for questions. So you can, I'm going to put up the participants so I can see. You can raise your hand on Zoom, or you can type your question into the chat and I will read it out if you are shy or not somewhere where you can verbally ask a question. Before we get started, for opening up in the audience, I have a question about it and this is partially as a journal editor. We are constantly trying to deal with the question of authorship as rewards for things that don't normally come under the heading of authorship. And so I sort of have, we have, most journals have pretty stringent guidelines, usually following COPE or something for uh, what qualifies as authorship. And those guidelines are set up to prevent abuse. So they're set up on the traditional method. We have to have these so people just don't add friends and relatives. There is a growing realization among, editors and journals that we need to broaden that to include people who do not fit the traditional model. But outside of that, are there other ways to not reward, to acknowledge, sort of formally acknowledge in the sphere of Western science, the contribution of people whose contributions are important, but there's like what have you heard or thought about as mechanisms for doing that?
Yeah, I appreciate this challenge and this question a lot. I mean, I think for one thing, like just saying their names in presentations, I make an effort to say people's names in presentations. Just ending this idea that I am a scientist and I do this work because I am the one with an academic title. And so when I present on my work, right, or when I write about my work, I think it's just so ingrained. I don't think it's anything. I mean, I still have a habit of doing it. I probably did it in this presentation, but it's so ingrained in the way that we think about the endeavor of science as being a smart person at a desk. But really, the practice of science is necessarily community engaged, whether it's community based research or not. Right? We have our colleagues that we're always learning from. We have our students who I know the authorship system is designed in a sense to protect students, right? And to ensure that they're getting credit. I think too, as I said, authorship is not necessarily valued by everyone. But sometimes knowledge holders in Palau want to be credited. We've, since that first study that I did, always apply for an exception at the IRB for this call to have anonymous and confidential sources, always ensuring participants' anonymity. In the vast majority of cases, the knowledge holders that we work with don't want to be anonymous. Um, they're very proud to be knowledge holders, and it's important in Palauan culture to recognize, I learned this from David, right? Or I learned this from Brian, whoever. Um, and so part of it is including their names within the publication, right? Or in any presentations. I didn't do that with this presentation because, again, this was like the interviews that I shared were from that first study where I guaranteed confidentiality to folks. But I think, there are ways we can, in our daily practice, just be a little bit more mindful of saying the person's name that we learned something from. But yeah, I don't, it's hard because it's so ingrained in our institutions.
No, I agree. I know it was a tough question. I hate to open it up on something like that. Do we have some more questions from the audience? From the room? Good. No, I'll repeat. We have one in the room with the students, so I'll just repeat it because the sound's not very good. Need specific researchers to work. Okay, so yeah, we have a question in the room about if there's any researchers that are particularly working sort of like you do on decolonializing research, whether there's any names that you could recommend that our students also look at their work.
Oh my God, so many that I don't even want to say, like I would rather provide a list, and I'm so happy to do that, to provide like a short reading list of folks that I admire. But I mean,
Sure.
Andrew Reed is at UBC, right? Just as one name that immediately comes to mind. Am I wrong about that? Is she not at UBC?
Sorry.
Andrea Reed, is she at UBC? I thought.
Yes, yes,
Yes,
yes. In
that's what I
fact,
thought.
this is
Okay.
one of Andrew's graduate students who asked that. So I
Oh,
think
wonderful.
that one's covered. But if maybe if you could think of a few others for, because that is an important
Definitely.
consideration in a number of researchers and graduate students to think about. So I think if they could read more widely on it, that would be appreciated.
Yes, I would love to do that. And
Yeah,
just
the
another
Pacific
Canadian.
Islands maybe in particular.
Okay, yeah, I'll think about the Pacific Islands too. Yeah,
Okay.
like I said, rather than like randomly name a bunch of people over the next 20 minutes, I'll just
No,
come up
no,
with
that's
something
fine.
there afterward.
Okay. There's a comment online. I'll just read it out. So many thanks for reminding us that we need to show more respect and acknowledge the role of the first order information sources, even if they're not scientists. Their experiences are important and we need to preserve them in our scientific studies and records. Yeah, I think you kind of talked about that and the difficulties of even doing that if your intentions are the best intentions, but the system may not allow you to do that. So yeah, the IRB would be a good case in point.
Yes, you can
Um,
apply for an exception.
yeah. Oh, there's another question. Sorry, I missed that. Sorry, Emma. Thank you for sharing your knowledge and experience, situating within the community as an observer and engaging with empathy instead of going with species conservation agenda. As you said, reciprocity and adapting to local cultural practices is an important ethical shift. So that's more of a statement than a question, but I don't know if you want to reflect on that as well.
I'll just say maybe the reason I chose to include my son in the last slide is that I think I was really trained, and I don't think this is unique to Stanford. I was really trained to be quite cold as a researcher. Even the idea of participant observation from anthropology, right, is like you're engaging at a distance. Um, and what I've learned is that we have to bring and embrace our humanity because um, ultimately what we're doing is like talking to people. And bringing my son was so special because it sort of reinforced or reiterated this idea that like I'm not separate from, I'm not apart from as a researcher, that I'm someone who's humbly coming and being invited into a community, and that includes my family. So yeah, I think like rehumanizing the researcher and recognizing the humanity of the quote researched, right? Just meeting on the same level. It's such an obvious thing to say, but it feels really radical in the way that we are taught to do science.
Right. Another question. You briefly touched upon the impact of commercialization of sea cucumbers on women fishers. Maybe if you could elaborate on it a bit more, how are women impacted and what role did government play in the transition?
Yeah, great. Thank you. So I only sort of teased, but it was really men that were able to benefit. So it was only 6 months, first of all, in 2011, that they allowed the export of sea cucumbers from Palau. And the closure of the fishery is actually like another paper that we wrote. It's amazing. It didn't only happen in Palau, it also happened in Yap and Pohnpei. That within a year, the community was like, whoa, this is really bad. They're taking a ton of sea cucumbers. This is not good. This isn't worth any amount of money. And literally, this like millions-dollar trade that was happening was shut down by fishers who were like lobbying the government, basically, by chiefs and then by fishers. So that's a pretty amazing story in and of itself, just about the assertion of indigenous values in the face of like very, very lucrative opportunities. Um, but the women were unfortunately not able to take advantage of the export trade as much because they're not the ones that have motorboats. Men's and women's fisheries are separated in Palau so that women are mainly doing the nearshore gleaning, the invertebrates, and then men are really the one going out on boats and getting the finfish. And so they were the ones that were able to exploit the fishery a lot more effectively. But when the Chinese left or were kicked out, it was really the women who were the only ones still interested in collecting sea cucumbers. The women who had been doing it all along, but now like their CPUE, if you will, like they had to put in so much more effort to get so many fewer sea cucumbers that just like most of them stopped doing it. Um, and so they were impacted because for, a lot of them, this was a source of income. The small local market that is still allowed was a source of income for them. But again, it was just this massive cultural impact as well, that this activity that they would do with their friends and with their kids was no longer really a viable activity. That answers your question.
Okay.